Welcome back. You're still tuned in to News and Views with myself, Salai Lomakwidi. The time is 8:45, and we're going to be switching gears now to another interesting conversation. COP30 in Belém has wrapped up, and if it was meant to be the COP of truth, the truth is very, very uncomfortable. No agreement to phase out fossil fuels, delayed commitments on climate finance, and a widening gap between what science demands and what global politics can actually deliver. More than 80 countries have now broken ranks, moving outside the UN system to push for voluntary fossil fuel phase outs, while the core COP negotiations stalled under pressure from oil producing nations. It's a moment that exposes, I think, the limits of consensus based climate diplomacy, and raises very, very important questions. Has the world just taken another step backward at a time when the window to keep 1.5 Celsius alive is rapidly closing? And joining us to unpack what this means for Africa, the global south, and climate change justice will be in a bit. Climate change activist Sunny Morgan, who we're still trying to get on air. But I think it's a very, very important conversation. While the rest of the world was focused on the G20, there was another important kind of summit that was taking place, and that was the COP30. And we'll be looking at, I think, a failure, as many people like to put it. And it's going to be interesting to see if there's going to be any remedial actions that are coming out of it. But what was interesting for me was there was no fossil fuel phase out plan just yet. The conclusion from the conference when it comes to fossil fuels was that there were numerous points of orders and objections that were being taken during the closing plenary session to the adoption of a number of some of those decisions. The most significant point of contention was the removal of any reference to reducing fossil fuels from the final text during the final negotiations. I think it was Juan Carlos Monterrey, who's a climate envoy for Panama, is reported to have stated in response: it fails the Amazon, it fails science, it fails justice, and it fails the people we are here to represent. Failing to name the cause of the climate crisis is not compromise, it's denial, it's criminal. And many Pacific Island states, I think the EU and Australia have also called for efforts to accelerate the world's transition away from coal, away from oil and gas. And the Brazilian government had proposed including the development of a roadmap in the decision text, which would make good the commitment at COP28 to plan the phasing out of fossil fuels. But ultimately, the removal of any roadmap from the final text is a major win for oil rich Arab countries, for Russia, India, and developing countries which are dependent on such fuels. I can even throw in South Africa in there as one of the countries. But otherwise, we have Sunny Morgan back. He's a climate change activist, and we'll be chatting to him just briefly about COP30 and if it yielded the kind of I don't know, results that we would have expected to. A lot of analysts saying, well, it didn't. And Sunny is joining us to unpack what this means for global South, for South Africa. Sunny, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to News and Views. Really appreciate to be chatting to you again.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invite, as usual.
I think we'll jump right into it. The big picture, and the question that everyone is asking themselves right now: did COP30 fail?
The answer is, it's not a simple answer, simply because the central demand that most people, activists and negotiators wanted wasn't included, which was obviously the phasing out of fossil fuels. But there were wins in other ways, but a great disappointment that the roadmap for the phasing out of fossil fuels wasn't included in the final text. It was discussed extensively and would have made it had it not been for, I'm going to say, the interference of fossil fuel companies, countries dependent on fossil fuels. And the key driver from the rumors in the hall was that Saudi Arabia was the most vociferous opponent of the inclusion. And so in that sense, it was a failure, but it was not unexpected because fossil fuel lobbyists, representatives, and countries outnumbered, I think, the negotiators by a factor of 3-1. So yeah, very, very dangerous times in terms of not getting that roadmap of the phasing out of fossil fuels in this declaration. Hello?
Yes, Annie, I can hear you. I want to focus on exactly that, the removal of the fossil fuel roadmap. I think it was, if I'm not mistaken, the Brazilian presidency who pushed for a fossil fuel phase out roadmap, but it was stripped out at the last minute. What does this say or tell us about the power, as you mentioned, oil-rich nations when it comes to climate diplomacy, and what does it cost vulnerable countries like those that are in the global south?
No. It highlights the influence of the fossil fuel lobby, whether they are state representatives and state actors or whether they are private consultants. It does highlight their influence, and that's the sad part of the process, and why it wasn't a surprise in the end. Of course, there's always a place for optimism, and it's what activists like myself who were in the halls, walking around, going to the stalls, talking to people, talking to other activists on site. That was the danger, that the fossil fuel lobby will win in the end, and they did. And it is it's a disaster for global South countries, where we want to accelerate the transition, and where the effects of fossil fuel extraction are most played out. The global north is, to a sense, insulated. Places like Norway that have pristine rivers, lakes, fresh air, but are major players in the oil value chain around the world, particularly in the global south. So the fight goes on, of course, to Turkey and then to Ethiopia, where the next two COPs will be held. But for now, let's focus on what we won, and even that is not significant, but it's a step in the right direction. And the work still needs to be done.
Mm, 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 mm. Um, let's bring it to, the global south countries, as you mentioned. What would you say are little victories that we can take out from this COP30? Are there any positives, looking at what we walked away with? Because it almost feels like it was just another talk shop with empty promises that global south countries and the realities that we face doesn't really give us anything. It was just
Yeah.
delayed
So
adaptations, finance, and just softer reporting requirements to a large extent.
no, it's very frustrating, and that's a criticism of society. Why do we go to COP? What role does it play? Is it just a big talk shop? But there have been some quick wins, and some developments that cement the process going forward. For instance, there's been a tripling of the climate adaptation finance by 2035. So most governments agree to significantly increase funds for adaptation, and the aim is that by 2035 it will be triple the amount that it currently is. This reflects a strengthened global commitment to support vulnerable and developing that suffer the most from the climate impacts. So this was a core demand of climate justice activists like ourselves, and specifically when we discuss equity. The second thing was the launch of the Just Transition Mechanism, or what is referred to as the JTM. COP30 introduced a mechanism meant to support the just transition. So of course, we always talk about the just transition, and it's always there in all of the texts, but this was the first time that a mechanism had been introduced for fair and equitable shift towards low carbon economies, especially for workers and for communities affected by the decarbonization. And that's going to be places that will benefit, like Mpumalanga, that will probably suffer the most. It's a province that's going to suffer the most in South Africa. While many details remain to be worked out, right, the fact that the mechanism now exists is a step in the right direction.
Mm.
Also the adoption of global adaptation tracking framework. So this is the evaluation, the monitoring. We strengthen all of those in this COP. So it's wins at every successive COP that gets us further down the road with a very, very comprehensive monitoring and evaluation framework. Um, what we learned from G20 in South Africa and the reports that are coming out, it was mirrored in COP30. It's the
Mm.
renewed multilateral cooperation and institutional momentum. We're beginning to see the power shift away from the centers like the US. The US was not represented at COP30, just like it wasn't represented here at the G20. But a successful COP, nevertheless, a successful G20, nevertheless. So, despite deep divisions, COP30 preserved multilateral processes under the UNFCCC, maintaining global cooperation on climate, which is an essential baseline. Nothing about us without us, and people were at the table. The big wins were for small island nations whose voices somebody referred to the small island developing nations and the global south, and specifically vulnerable communities, as the moral voice of COP, and that was clearly played out. What was also important was political recognition and impetus for inclusion, social dimensions. The role of social institutions, civil society was cemented in a very, very fundamental and visible way. What was really striking, because we're always talking about the Palestinian issue. Whenever I'm on the show, we talk about the
Mm.
Palestinian issue. When I went to COP in Egypt, I was not even allowed through the security with my kafia.
Mm.
But at COP30, there were hundreds. And when I say hundreds, you couldn't find 5 people with one not wearing a kafia. In the green zone, which is a civil society zone, two of the most popular pavilions was the pavilion that was talking about Israeli ecocide. They were releasing a new report, and another one entitled "If Gaza Could Speak." So, global solidarity for Palestine in every single action, because there were also civil society actions within the main auditorium, both in the blue and the green zones. Palestine featured very strongly. So, this idea of not just Palestine and Gaza, the genocide, but also the issue of what we would say were previously unrepresented or wasn't strongly represented issues
Mm.
and nations and causes were very fundamental. So this idea that civil society, social institutions, social inclusion was a big win, and I think there's no turning back now. So those are the things we can talk about. I don't want to call it soft wins. I want to talk about it fundamental gains to show that activism and civil society and the influence of movements are growing in a big and very sustainable way. Of course, COP is about emissions, and there wasn't a big win there, but we have enough to work on to make sure that we win more going forward, both in Turkey and in Ethiopia.
Mm, mm. Lastly, before I let you go, Sunny, the dream of 1.5 degrees Celsius, is that
Mm.
still alive or on life support, so to say? I think it was the UN Secretary General that said we are overshooting 1.5 degrees Celsius with COP30, offering an increment change at best. Is 1.5 degrees Celsius still achievable, or are leaders pretending we have more time than we actually do?
Um, Hard question, but I've been a climate justice activist for almost 20 years, and 1.5 was always supposed to be alive, and we are always trained and told and said to be hopeful. Personally, as an activist, I think we've overshot it already. In fact, we have overshot it by some in some measurements around the world, but consistently we're not over 1.5. We'd like to think it's still alive. I think it's to use your words, it's on life support, and we're losing the battle.
There we go. Sunny Morgan, climate activist and longtime voice for environmental justice. Thank you so much for chatting to us. Always a pleasure.
Thanks for inviting me. Great show.
Eh, There you go. COP30 may be over, but as the UN warns, the hard work is far from being done. And if the formal processes won't move fast enough, the pressure from activists like Sunny and communities around the world that are climate vulnerable will only grow louder. This is News and Views with me, Salailo Makwidire, on Salam Media. Stay with us. More comes after this short break.